while still reminding you that this car is an outright land missile and you better take it seriously. What is up, YouTube? Welcome to Fred's Full Throttle. This week, I wanted to do a Corvette owner's review of the Porsche 911 992 Turbo S. I wanted to share my thoughts and impressions from driving it on the track, and then in a couple weeks I'll be doing a similar video for the 992 GT3, and then comparing both cars to my C7 Grand Sport. At that time, I will also share some updates as to what this means for my car ownership prospects, and if this changes anything for me on the Z06. So stick around, I've got a lot to cover, and let's dive right in. So first, I wanted to qualify myself a bit so you can kind of mentally categorize my review. I would classify myself as a moderately experienced driver, likely with an intermediate ability level. I have driven a variety of performance cars previously, including various Porsches, a Lamborghini Gallardo, Corvettes, and BMWs. I've taken several driver instruction courses with lots of on-track seat time and have started doing autocross. Though this is a car channel, I come also with over 20 years of on-road motorcycle experience and a decade of motorcycle track day experience, so I'm familiar with speed. I currently own a C7 Grand Sport Corvette with a manual that I've owned since new, and I've put over 16,000 miles on it. I'd also like to qualify that I'm not a racer and I'm not a seasoned track day rat in cars. I'm also not an LS swap gifted mechanic. Over time, I'm working to achieve all of those things, but I think it's important to be realistic about my ability and experience. This was also my second time at Porsche Experience Center, PEC, having previously rented a 991.2 GT3 back in 2019. Now, if you haven't been to PEC or are new to my channel, I did a pretty detailed overview video of PEC and what the entire experience was like. Feel free to check it out, and I'll link to it in the description below. Now that I've set the stage, let's get on to what you're really all here for, the car. This video is about the 992 Turbo S, primarily because that's the first car they put me in when I was at PEC. The way the sessions work is that I paid for 90 minutes of track time between the Turbo S and the GT3. After the first 45 minutes, we pulled in, swapped out to an already warmed up GT3. It was pretty awesome. PEC doesn't allow you to record your own driving footage, and because my friends and I were all out on the track driving at the same time, there was no one from our group to film us. That's okay though, because I wouldn't have been really able to talk during the driving. It was pretty intense. All you would have heard would have been squeals, laughing, and gasps to catch my breath, and, well, also the wail of the engines. Alright, so on to the 992 Turbo S. So a quick summary of this car. This car is a monster in every way, shape, and form. 640 horsepower, 590 pound-feet of torque from a 3.75-liter twin-turbo flat-six engine mounted aft of the rear axles. It revs to 7,200 RPM, develops max torque from 2,500 to 4,000 RPM, and delivers all that to the ground via a very fancy all-wheel drive system. It features dynamic suspension, rear-wheel steering, and dynamic engine mounts. There is no manual option, however the transmission in the car is the benchmark for all double-clutch transmission makers, the Porsche PDK, and in this case it was an 8-speed unit. All of this adds up to some completely bonkers performance figures. Porsche says that it has a 0 to 60 time of 2.6 seconds, which is a sandbagged number. Car and Driver tested the 2021 version of this car and reached 0 to 60 in 2.2 seconds, only a tenth off the quickest accelerating car they've ever tested, with that being the venerable 918 Spider, a car that costs 4 times as much and 235 horsepower more. Also, the top speed of the Turbo S is 205 miles an hour from the factory. Now, this is a car that on paper is a relative performance bargain, even with a starting price of, brace for it, $205,000. And moderately optioned cars cost as much as I paid for my house, about $300K. I say that's a bargain because when you start talking about the cars that this is going to take the lunch money from, you're talking about Ferrari 488 Pistas, Lamborghini Hurricane Performantes, and the McLaren 720S. Cars that all cost many times as much as what this one costs. Now, they say that you should never meet your heroes because they can let you down. I was willing to take one for the team and give this one a shot though. The first thing that strikes you about the Turbo S is that it looks relatively, dare I say, unremarkable. When parked, the wing is retracted, there's not much crazy aero, and even the one I drove came in a fairly boring grayish-green color. It didn't look too far off the mark from a regular Carrera S that was parked nearby. It is a beautiful car to me, with graceful curves, a muscular stance, and an understated purposefulness about it. As a longtime Porsche fan, I'm somewhat biased, but even if you stripped out the badges and just saw the profile of the car, it looks graceful and sleek. Maybe Porsche's onto something with honing that recipe. Anyway, climbing into the car, I was well aware of the complaints that owners and enthusiasts have had and other Porsche files, namely the screens and the gear selector. This being my first time in a 992 generation car, I was actually totally fine with it. The shifter is small, it does its job, and it isn't in the way. I didn't see an issue. The screen was also clear to read, looked nice, was responsive, and worked well. The interior is Spartan, without a lot of doodads and gizmos cluttering it up. The doors seal well, and the car is quiet inside. Everything conveys a sense of purpose and quality. Finishes all appear to be upper shelf without being elitist. This is a nice place to be, while still reminding you that this car is an outright land missile and you better take it seriously. My instructor Chris then walked me through setting up the correct driving position, and then went into a few of the menus on the main screen to set up the car the way that he wanted. Louder exhaust, tighter suspension, things like that. Then we started up the car, which was somewhat unremarkable other than two things. A, having a physical key that you have to put in and then turn, and B, it's on the left side of the steering wheel. The engine started quickly, settled into an off-quiet idle. Being honest, it sounded unremarkable. It didn't give any real indication as to the capability under the surface, and I kind of liked that. So we got out onto the track and started doing pace-building activities around the main circuit. Mostly this was to get me used to the car and to the track. Despite the larger size of the 992 over the 991, this car didn't feel large. It was smooth, poised, and it felt infinitely capable. Steering is tight with moderate weight behind it, but I was surprised that I couldn't feel any noticeable drag from having all-wheel drive. Increasing pace also didn't change the feel of the car or its assuredness. As I started to put the tires on the concrete going around the corners, I found that nothing really is going to unsettle this car. It was sort of like having Henry Cavill's Superman sitting next to me in the passenger seat saying, "We're good. We're good," throughout the drive. The car is literally unflappable. Wanting me to see how the all-wheel drive affects the 992 platform, Chris had me head over to the Skidpad. It's polished concrete with sprinklers soaking it throughout to minimize grip. I pulled out onto the Skidpad expecting the car to drift like a champ, and it didn't. As soon as you'd blip the gas to initiate a slide and then correct for it, you suddenly felt a little bit disconnected. The throttle response would change, you'd feel different corners of the car pulling, and alarms came up on the dashboard about wet driving. Interestingly, according to Chris, there are microphones in the wheel wells to detect the sound of water. With enough water noise, the car will alert you and advise you to put the car into wet mode. Then Chris dropped a bombshell. He pointed out that the car was still driving nearly as composed as it was on a dry circuit, and I was having a heck of a time getting it to step out of line. For all the power it had, it meant that it was driving in a controlled manner, despite my best attempts to the contrary. This, he said, is the turbo's Achilles heel, and why you need to pay attention to the different drive modes. The car and all its technology, its electro-wizardry, and its layers of performance systems are designed for one thing: to stay in control at insane speeds. This car was fighting me, and it was winning. Now with that lesson taught, we then started dialing back some of the levels of intrusion and relaxing the controls, and it started to feel like the car was a little bit more energetic. It would let me add more abrupt throttle, and it would do some impression of a drift, but didn't really feel quite there yet. So then we turned everything off: traction control, stability control, everything off. If the car was a pendulum, and we're trying to find our balance on it, we just swung way too far the other way. The slightest provocation and all the wheels are spinning and the car becomes a maniac. There was no delicate throttle control. Everything was too sensitive, and it was incredibly easy to spin out, even when feathering the throttle barely at all. This was my first sign of the beast inside the car, and it was pretty shocking. Now, one really interesting party trick that this car has when you're trying to drift was demonstrated to me firsthand. Now, if you've ever tried to drift a car and you feel you're doing all right, but then you feel the oversteer start to build a little too far, what do? Well, you let off the throttle. This slows the rear tires and gives you a chance to steer further into it and hopefully to recover. This car doesn't do that. My instructor Chris told me to do something crazy, something insane. When you start to feel it go, steer more into it, but then give it more throttle. What? It actually took me 2 or 3 tries before I could even kind of rewire my brain and that muscle memory with rear-wheel drive cars to even try it. Once I did it though, I got to see the trick. The front end will claw for grip and actually pull the car back into line by adding power rather than chopping it. It's super counterintuitive if you've driven rear-wheel drive cars for a while, and further, now you're going quite a bit faster than before because that freight train of power is right behind you and you better be ready for it. Alright, so that was enough of the Skidpad for me. While very interesting, it wasn't particularly fun to wrestle with a car that cost nearly as much as my house, and I was ready for something a little bit different. I wanted to meet this Jekyll and Hyde of a car. The calm, collected chauffeur that disguises a madman. So we went off to the drag strip. Chris said that we needed to dry off the tires and get some heat back into them before we could do any of the other dry handling exercises, so this meant a couple big launches with launch control. Car's still dripping with water, wipers still going, we lined up. The process is dead simple. Left foot hard on the brake, right foot press the gas pedal right to the floor, let the RPM build till it levels out, which I believe is around 5,000 RPM, don't quote me on that, and as soon as it levels, release the brake. So you're sitting there, brake down, gas down. In the span of less than a second, the revs build, a loud growl emanates from the back of the car, and you can feel the car kind of like vibrating with the tension of all that power. You know how a washing machine on spin cycle is kind of like seething with energy and shaking, vibrating like it wants to launch? That is the embodiment of this car. Break off. What follows was a four-wheel burnout for at least 10 or so feet, and then it happened. The car hooked up. In what can best be described as like tunnel vision combined with frightening acceleration, the car surged forward. The PDK is so seamless with shifting that there is no lapse in power, just raw, unbridled force hitting you. That quiet exhaust from before was gone, and the deep growl was changing to a howl that fills your ears. We reached our braking markers in just a few seconds and circled back for another run. After a second wheel spin start, the car was now dry, and we circled back to really see what the car could do. Now with the water shaken off, Chris assured me that this would be an even more violent experience. Reassuring, right? He was right. Same process as before, however this third run, before the brake pedal has even returned back to its normal position, the car launches. It pushes you back in the seat uncomfortably hard. Everything else around you stops. Time halts for a moment, and you scream a silly, "Ugh!" as the car unleashes its full brutal power. The faster it goes, the harder it accelerates. It's beautiful, thrilling, scary, and fun all at once. You know that feeling you get when you go down the first hill of a roller coaster? That zero-G feeling inside you? You feel that, but going horizontally. Now, I've been in some fast cars, most notably an 800 horsepower Nissan GTR a couple years back, and we did some full-bore launches in it. This car was every bit as fast as that, if not faster. Chris later explained that the front and rear distribution of power starts out pretty heavily rear biased at the beginning of the launch, but as the front end grips during the launch, that balance shifts forward, literally pulling the car along as the back wheels keep pushing. Time unpauses, and that violent surge of power shoves you down the straight. The braking zone that was a long ways away before is suddenly whipping by your window, hard on the brakes. PEC teaches you that the car's brakes can be absolutely relied upon. Just stand on them and the car will stop quickly and without drama. There was no shaking, there was no wavering, there was no imbalance. That short stopping area at the end of the straight actually seems too big. If this rocket ship is quick at gaining speed, it's even better at shedding it. I asked Chris if these cars had the carbon ceramic brakes, and he shook his head saying, "They don't really need them. We've found the standard brakes are just fine for what we do here." That's pretty high praise indeed. Now, as I reached into the deeper capabilities of this car, we went over to the low friction handling circuit where you're taught to kick out that back end and drift through the corners. Piece of cake. One of the great things about the Turbo S is that rear bias for power that I mentioned earlier. So it feels more like driving a rear wheel drive car while having some of the benefits of all wheel drive. You can play with those settings if you want, but even right out of the box, the car knows when you're trying to have fun, and with the right mode selected, you can do your best Chris Harris impression around those big sweeping corners. Now, it's not all fun and games. The car isn't perfect. There was some noticeable turbo lag and just the slightest hesitation when you're lolling along and then you whomp on the gas. Maybe a tenth or two, but it's there. The steering is also heavier than I realized upon moving over to the GT3. More on that when I review the GT3. While sharp, reasonably communicative, and with no slop, it almost feels like the steering has just a touch too much resistance transmitted back to the driver. Likely that's related to the front drivetrain and the additional equipment that moves when you turn the wheel. That said, the biggest downside of this car is not even the price, which is substantial. No, the biggest downside is that this is the ruiner of other cars. No other car you drive can do so much, so composed, so easily. A car that can scare you, thrill you, and do it while being incredibly comfortable. Side note, those 18-way adjustable seats are amazing. No, this car's biggest flaw is that it absolutely mocks all lesser cars, and then it has the gall to be a nearly unattainable price. As a more or less normal guy, the new Z06 is expensive for me. Attainable, but really nearing the limit of what I can comfortably afford. The Turbo S starts at more than double that price. If you've ever flicked through the Porsche configurator online, you know that a few of the must-have options alone are going to push this car deep into the $250,000 range or higher. And yet, as much as I viscerally reject that price tag, it's actually worth it. It doesn't even make sense to me as I say it. How can a car that costs this much actually be worth the price? But it is. Anyone who says otherwise hasn't driven one yet. Nice job, Porsche. Very well done. Now, as mentioned before, don't worry, Corvette content is still my heavy focus, but I will be interspersing some other videos like these into my releases. In a couple of weeks, my next Porsche Experience Center video will be my review of the 992 GT3 and a bit of a comparison between it, the Turbo S, and my C7 Grand Sport. I'll also share my thoughts on where the C8 Z06 is going to fit into this mix. Lastly, for anyone who has stuck around till now, first of all, thank you. I just bought a Yamaha JetBlaster Wave Runner a couple of weeks ago. It's a brand new model for Yamaha and they're very hard to get a hold of. I ordered mine last August and just got it this April. Let me know if you'd like me to do an owner's review of it. There aren't any on YouTube right now. This would be via a shorter out-of-band video, meaning not part of my normal Friday release schedule, and it would not replace any of my car content. This is always going to be a car channel first. Instead, this video would be like a Wednesday or something. If, however, you don't want to see that, then just let me know in the comments. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and until next time, Fred out!